You don't need 8 hours a day. You don't need complete silence. You need a chair. You need to understand that the smallest things in life connect to the biggest ones. And if you have the patience to work your way from the end of your small thread all the way up to the big spool, you'll have a story. And you taught me that, and I carry that into my adult life, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. So, I hope that doesn't embarrass you.
Okay, if there wasn't an audience here, I would lunge across and give you a huge hug.
I wanted to start by asking you a few questions about the book, Miller's Valley, and then move into some other issues, questions about writing, current events. My first question is about the epigraph in the book, which is from James Baldwin. Do you know it by heart? I have it here.
I don't have to know it by heart, but I know the phrase, an irrevocable condition.
Yes.
He says that home isn't a place, it's an irrevocable condition, which is why it's one of my favorite quotes.
I love it, and I totally agree. And I'm hoping you can tell us why you chose that quote to start the book and how it relates to Miller's Valley.
Well, it relates to my own life in terms of a sense that I persistently have that I have become over the years like a Russian nesting doll, known as a matryoshka. In the very middle, there's a little girl named Anna, and then there's a teenager, and then there's a young woman and a young mother and an older woman. And all of those people contribute to who I am today. And all of those people are still in there. Somewhere deep inside is that little girl. And I think that's true of all of us, and it's part of what this book is about. This is the first novel I've written that covers a broad span of time. I've been very comfortable in the past with writing novels that are within a very discrete time frame, usually about a year. But with this, I start with Mimi when she's 11 and go up to the time when she's in her 60s. And I think of her being all those pieces within her. But what's within her, as much as anything else, is Miller's Valley. And of course, it's not the Miller's Valley that she was a little girl in. And it's not the Miller's Valley that she was a young woman in. And yet all of those exist within her, too. I mean, as I always say, I haven't been back to the house where I grew up outside of Philadelphia since I was 14 years old and my parents sold it. But I could walk through that house and tell you everything. I can tell you exactly where everything is. Well, of course, I haven't been 14 for almost 50 years, which means that house has probably been repainted and maybe expanded and reconfigured and done over and over again. And yet, the wallpaper in my parents' dressing room and the wallpaper in the bedroom where I live, they live forever in my mind. And that's what I think Baldwin means by an irrevocable condition. I mean, whether you hated where you grew up and never want to go back, whether you loved it and live there still, it's inside you as surely as your heart or your lungs are.
In the book, the town of Miller's Valley is very much at a crossroads. It is at risk of becoming what is known as a drowned town. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that concept of the drowned town, how you came upon it, and also how Mimi herself, the main character, is at a crossroads in time. She's born at a very interesting moment in history. She arrives at a path, at a place where two roads diverge. She goes one way, her friend goes the other. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, like me, Mimi is born and grows up at a moment when suddenly the world starts to break open for women. I mean, every year on her birthday, I try to remember to send Gloria Steinem an email that says, "Thank you for my life." Because I really feel like feminism. And so Mimi is a little girl, as I was, although we're quite who looks around her and thinks, what does the future hold for me? Her mother is a nurse, and that's the only job that she can think of that a woman can hold in her community and at this time. And then as she becomes a teenager, the doors start to open for her. And so I think as a character, she reflects what have been really seismic changes in the lives of American women, so that where she is when she begins and what she expects when she begins is utterly different in some ways, in most ways, than where she winds up. The idea of having Miller's Valley be a place that was under threat from the government had to do with that moment in time, too, because Mimi was born at a time when we still trusted the government. When they told us something, we believed that it was true. And she becomes a teenager at that moment with Vietnam and Watergate, when we realized that that, in fact, was not the case. And I think that's an important inflection moment in American history as well as in the history of women. But the use of the water and the idea of the flooding is also really metaphoric, because I think America is a place that disappears itself with frightening regularity. I mean, the prototype always seems to me when I go to some little town someplace, and the main street is lined with big Victorian houses that have all become quite shabby and are often broken up into offices. And then I drive 20 minutes outside of town, and there are bulldozers that are making yet another cul-de-sac with another circle of new homes. And I just think, do I live in the only country on earth where that makes sense? Because there is this sense in America of reinvention, of newness. And the problem with embracing novelty is that you leave your past in the dust. As a nation.
You've spoken about how our country has amnesia.
Right.
We keep making the same mistakes
Right.
over and over.
I think the contrast is we disappear our past, we forget our past as a nation. As individuals, as Faulkner said, the past isn't over, it's not even past. And I think that's true for all of us in our lives.
I wanted to circle back to something you said about this novel is not autobiographical.
Mm-hmm.
I read somewhere that you said when you were writing your column, people were always looking for ways to prove that it was false, that what you had written was false, and that once you started writing novels, everybody was looking for ways to prove that your fiction was actually true.
Absolutely. I mean, it was mind-boggling. I mean, I worked at the New York Times where there were more layers of editors than there are layers of the earth. I mean, you know, I used to jump out of bed at night at 11 o'clock and think, I got that wrong. Oh my God, the lead is completely wrong. And I'd go through my notebook and then I'd be like, oh no, it's right. And then I'd go back to bed and I'd think, wait, did I read that correctly? I mean, I had something that I think of as reporter's paranoia, which is the idea that you might have gotten the facts wrong. So the idea that people were saying, oh, your people make that stuff up, I would think, no. And then, of course, as soon as I write a novel, somebody says to me, even with this one, it's my 8th novel. And I'm out in California on book tour, and a woman comes up to me and says, I'm from right next to Miller's Valley. And I said, excuse me? And she said, and she named some town in California, and she said, the town that was buried underwater by the government. I live right next door to it, and I said, I've never heard of it, I've never been there. And you could tell that she thought, well, I guess she has to say that. And it happened twice in California, once in Chicago, twice in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. On the one hand, there's a frustration. On the other hand, there's an excitement. Because obviously, you've created a place that seems so real that someone thinks it must exist in the real world.
Yes.
And I mean, that's what you're trying to do when
Yes.
you write a novel. You're trying to live in this world, and if you're doing it right, on the days when you're doing it right, it seems so much more real to you than your real life it's almost as though you come out of this trance and you walk downstairs and think, oh, I'm not in Miller's Valley, I'm on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And there's something kind of thrilling about that, creating a world. Well, you know from having done it, creating a world.
On the days when you don't want to be in that world, it's grim.
No, it's not when you don't want to be in it, it's when you can't get into it.
Yes.
When you're sitting there thinking,
right.
I can't make the magic happen. Oh, that's
really hard.
Oh, it's the worst.
Every person who I told that you were coming to Montclair told me they had saved one column of yours. Everyone felt that they had a personal psychic connection to you, including me. What is that like for you?
Well, I mean, obviously, at some level, it's kind of odd. Well, so my daughter and her best friend from high school, who was also her writing partner, were working in our den when I was getting ready to go out. And I walked through to get something, and I said, I'm such a fraud. And Maria said, oh, Mama, what is it now? And I said, I'm like schlumping around here in my bathrobe, and in 2 hours I'll be there, and those people will think I am somebody. And she looked up and said, oh, get over it, you do this all the time.
Your kids will keep you humble.
Exactly.
That's why you have to.
Boy,
Yeah.
I don't, I am pretty clear on the reason why Philip Roth thinks he's God. And it's because he's childless. If you had a 14-year-old boy saying, I can't believe you wrote this stuff in Portnoy's Complaint, it would be his entire life.
They're not impressed by
No,
that.
but what I will say about that personal connection people feel is writing is a conversation. And when you're sitting at the computer, all you can think of is, I'm talking to somebody, I just can't see them. It's almost like you can feel them, or you hope you can feel them. So that when you've been having that conversation alone in a little room by yourself for so long, and then you go out into the world and people say, hey, I'm the person who was on the other side of that conversation, that actually is
like a miracle.
It's a pretty aces feeling.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite images of what it means to tell stories is Dickens being on a boat coming into New York Harbor. No, it was Boston, I think. And people were lined up along the waterfront. It was near the end of the serialization of Curiosity Shop. And people were leaning over the edge, screaming at the boat, does little Nell live? And I just thought, well, that's it. You want to have that relationship with people so intimate that they are standing there crying for you to tell them.
Have you had that?
Whether the character is
Have you had that moment?
You have those moments where readers have become, I would say the single most powerful moment I've ever had was a woman who said to me, I called 911 holding black and blue in my hand. And that was like, I can die happy if I've had that kind of effect on the world.
That's amazing. You talked about the phenomenon of when you kind of write blind. You don't know exactly who will read your work, and you're writing for this audience that you can't see. Who is the voice in your head when you're writing? Is there a teacher who you still keep in mind? Do you keep your editor in mind or your agent? Who is that voice?
I think the reason that I don't need to do as many drafts now as I did when I started is because I completely internalized the voice of Kate Medina, who is the editor at Random House, who has been my editor on all my books. And whereas before I needed to wait for her to say to me, these 2 pages stop the flow of the narrative, and I don't really understand what I need to know about this character until too late, and so on and so forth. I can channel Kate more than I used to be able to do, and that's been kind of a gift. But I try to keep as much noise out of my head when I'm working on a novel as I possibly can. That's why I don't read reviews, because it's just noise. It's just noise that, and even the good ones are noise, because if something in Miller's Valley is praised, but I have no intention of doing it in the novel that I'm working on now, there's always that little voice saying, well, why don't you do that again? They really like that one. You know,
You can't market test a novel.
no,
It doesn't work.
I mean,
Do you already have the next novel in your head as you finish?
I have 15,000 words of the next novel
That's
on
impressive.
my hard disk. I just really
impressive.
feel like there's, you know what it's like, there's that horrible pre-pub period. So you write the novel, and then your editor sends you back her lovely notes, and then you rewrite the novel, and then the copy editor goes over the novel, and then you get first pass pages for any of those final little cleanup things. And then it's locked, and they come up with the cover, and so on and so forth. And then it's best case 6 months, lots of times 8 to 10 months before the book comes out. So the book is done. You cannot touch it, you cannot change it, and almost no one has read it. And it's sort of in that condition that you and I learned in school is called limbo.
Yes.
Because we're both Catholic school girls.
Yes.
Yeah, it's part purgatory for the writer.
Holy child people in the audience, welcome.
So I always feel like before I go on book tour, I have to have at least started, if not gotten a good head of steam up on a new one.
Yes.
Just to remind myself that there is in fact a new one in there.
Yes. I'm shifting gears slightly.
Uh-huh.
I mentioned that everybody has a favorite column. I think my favorite column is one where you say that when your children were small, you wished that you had spent more time listening to them. I could almost cry saying this, and less time listening to other parents. Can you talk a little bit about that?
More time doing it and less time getting it done. I'm seizing up here.
There are a lot of people in the audience.
It's a column called Goodbye Dr. Spa.
Yes.
And it makes the rounds on Mother's Day every year. You know, most of the time I'm incredibly critical of my own work. I hate to reread it or read it aloud because all I can see are the motes. But that one turned out okay, and one of the reasons it turned out okay was because I had such great material in the three of them. And that's certainly one that people mention with some regularity.
And two of your kids have grown up to be writers?
All three of my kids
Okay.
more or less are writers in some way or another. Well, I think it's like being a plumber's kid. You know, I have no idea how to fix that S-shaped thing under the sink. But if I were a plumber's kid, I'd just say, oh, you turn this and you turn that, and then you use the wrench and you take it out. And I think my kids sort of thought of writing as like plumbing. And then she gets a cup of coffee, and then she goes upstairs. And then she comes downstairs 2 hours later and says, oh my God. And then she gets another cup of coffee. I don't think, I won't say they didn't think it looked that hard. They thought it seemed doable.
Yes.
In a way that, frankly, I didn't until I did it, because I'd never, first of all, the writers I loved the most as a child were almost without exception dead. I mean, you know, I loved Dickens, I loved Jane Austen, I loved Little Women, I loved the Betsy Tacy books. But, you know, I was never going to meet any of those people. I was never going to meet Madeline Longa. And I didn't know how in the world they went about doing this. My kids, you know, my kids have grown up surrounded by writers, agents, books, and someone who just does this as a matter of course. And I think that's what led them to do this. Although their father, who is an attorney, did once say, not a W-2 income in the house.
They're better for it. How much research do you usually do for a book? Did you do a lot of research? Zero. Wow. Not even for Miller's Valley? Not for Black and Blue? Wow.
Black and Blue was the first and last time I thought about doing it.
Okay.
I didn't do anything for object lessons, and I didn't do anything. The only thing with one true thing was that I did have a conversation with an oncologist because I was highly sensitive to not being specific about the kind of cancer that Kate Quindlen has in the novel, because I was sensitive to someone who had that same kind of cancer reading the novel and thinking,
You got it
so
wrong.
this is how it ends.
Oh, wow.
So this is how it ends. But with Black and Blue, when I realized that Fran was going to take Robert and go down to Florida, I thought, well, you know, Anna, you've visited Florida from time to time, but you don't really know Florida, so you should make a plane reservation and go down there and walk around. And all of a sudden, with blinding clarity, I thought, you are not a reporter anymore. This is your Florida. And it doesn't make any difference whether it conforms to an actual Florida at all.
Yes.
And it was so liberating, and I never looked back from that. And I've never done any research on any of them.
Well, you create the world, and it feels
Well,
it feels very real.
I think if you can imagine it, it can happen.
Yes. Yes, I believe that.
I mean, even in every last one, which is where I pushed my imagination farthest into the darkest place of which I was capable, there were people afterwards who said to me, oh, isn't that based on the story of X? Or Still Life with Breadcrumbs. A couple of photographers said to me, well, obviously you spent time with the photographer. And I was like, she shoots, she scores.
When are you writing a novel set in a newsroom? Do you ever think about combining the two worlds, the
No.
newspaper world? Okay.
No, I mean,
You're very definite on that point.
honestly, the reason why there are almost no great newsroom movies, for example. I mean, there's His Girl Friday, which is really a madcap comedy that has relatively little to do with the newsroom.
Right.
And All the President's Men, which has to do with the greatest story, perhaps, in political history. A lot of the time in the newsroom is kind of tedium. You know, it's waiting for something to happen. It's waiting for the Metro desk to stand up and say, Quindlen!
Right.
You know, and I just don't think, I mean, reporters are there not for their own stories, but for the stories out there. So
Yes.
I read the stories out there because I was, for so many years, happily a reporter.
Did you take a lot of those skills from reporting, even if you don't do a lot of research? The discipline of being a reporter and having to produce a column once a week or however often you were doing it.
You
Did
know,
that help?
I studied creative writing in college, and I wanted to be a novelist from the time I was fairly young, but I'm not sure I could have done it had I not been a reporter first. It was such excellent training. It taught me to write even when I didn't feel like writing. It taught me the power of really well-chosen telling details. You know, of that small detail that can bring an entire scene to life. And from all those years of writing down people's words verbatim in my notebooks, I really learned that dialogue can really delineate character beautifully, very quickly, and that it's highly individual. And I'm really good now when I'm working on a novel. When I'm done a draft, I read the entire novel aloud because it's by ear that I can hear what's wrong and fix it. And more than anything else, I can hear when the dialogue is wrong. I mean, when you read aloud a line of dialogue and realize it does not in any way, shape, or form sound like anything that ever came out of a person's mouth, then you know to rewrite it, you know? And all of that I got from my life as a in the business.
Yeah.
And honestly, and I think this is an important thing for a novelist or a certain kind of novelist too, I became a better person because I was a newspaper reporter.
Because you learned to listen.
And also because of the opportunity to see all of the ways in which people live and struggle and triumph, and all of the ways in which people who are from radically different backgrounds, in radically different places, are so much alike at base. I mean, I loved the work, and
just, do you feel that it's better to have some time to metabolize an experience before putting it down on paper, or?
It was better for me, although, you know, I was writing about being a mother in real time. I mean, I hadn't metabolized a whole lot by the time I was writing about Quinn and Christopher.
Right.
But certainly for the hardest things in my life, it was important for me to have absorbed them. You know, the title of my first collection comes out of a comment from the managing editor at the New York Post. When I was 21 and a reporter there, I went to him and told him that I wanted my own column, because that's the girl I was. And he said to me, "You are a good enough writer to write a column, but you haven't lived enough to be capable of living out loud." And it was such a smart thing to say, because a column gives you a lot of leeway to make mistakes in a way that being a reporter doesn't as much. You're really putting yourself out there. And when I think about the mistakes I could have made putting myself out there at 21,
Right.
I can never thank him enough for that.
Think about the generation that we have now who are living from the time they're 12 on Instagram or on Facebook, and it's very hard to explain. This isn't going anywhere. This is a permanent record. It's not necessarily writing, but it is living out loud in a way that can be, I think, somewhat tricky.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not all bad.
And it can, but it can live forever.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, I wrote things when I was 15 and 16 that I am so happy don't live forever anyplace. So, and, you know, I think about the fact, when I was writing Life in the 30s, the boys were small, and my last Life in the 30s column was about Maria's birth. And then I did the op-ed page column, and there was a fair amount of publicity around what I was doing, and people would do magazine pieces or newspaper stories and so on and so forth, and they always said, "And we'll send a photographer to the house, and they'll take a picture of you with the kids." And Jerry and I made a decision very early on at a threshold level that nobody was ever going to take pictures of the children. It's just, and then they said, "Well, we'll do it from the back." And we'd say, no, here's the thing. It's not just having them out there that way, it's them thinking of themselves as the kind of children who have their pictures taken with their parents by professional photographers. That's not the life we live, that's not who they are. Now they have friends whose children's pictures are on Instagram from the moment that they're in the labor room, and I think, gee, have you thought about whether when they're 30 years old and, you know, maybe they're prominent in some field or another, they want people to be able to school back and know everything about them in that way. And I think perhaps the answer is no, they haven't thought about it, and no, they shouldn't do it.
Right. I think you might be. I think you're right. In a minute, we're going to take some questions from the audience, but I did want to read an extremely prescient quote that I wonder if you've revisited recently, that I found in a moment of light stalking in a February 1992 column of yours, and I think there are all these people in this room who love you and love your writing. I think this will prove that you are a little bit of able to predict the future. The word on Hillary Clinton, who assumed her husband's surname to advance his political career, this is in 1992, is that she's more intelligent and thoughtful than Bill, tougher and more ambitious. In other words, behind every so-so candidate is a smart woman who makes him look good because she was savvy enough to marry him. If we really believe that our political leaders don't have a clue about real life, look for a woman. I've rarely met a woman who didn't know more about the supermarket, the bus stop, and the prevailing winds than her male counterparts. Not to mention about childcare, human rights, abortion, the minimum wage, and sexual harassment. If it's so widely understood that the wives are superior to the candidates, shouldn't that tell us something about where to find the candidates to come? I'm wondering where you will be on November 11th, 2016. And could the
that surprised to hear that there have been many times over the last 20 years when I've been invited to write something for the New York Times as a guest. And I haven't done so, and I've thought often about when or if I would ever reappear in the pages of the paper. And I guess your question makes me suddenly realize that if I was ever going to do it, it might be the day when the first one of us becomes president of the United States.
And on that very happy note, I think we should start taking questions from the audience, even though I have a million more. But I know everyone here
Do we know where the microphones are? Do you know where the microphones are?
Here they are.
Who has the first question?
Hello. In your novel, Black and Blue, the woman that was battered, talk about her internal psyche and what she went through, and help us to a degree, understand why she would stay with someone. And you also presented her with an alternative that she took that really doesn't exist. Was that because it was too bleak without that alternative?
That isn't why I chose the alternative of this kind of underground railroad that makes it possible for women who are beaten to take their children and flee their abusers. But I've got to tell you that one of the hardest moments I've ever had as a novelist was when I was on tour with the paperback of Black and Blue, and a woman leaned into me and said, "This book meant a lot to me." And after the hardcover tour, I knew that that was code. With One True Thing, women would come up to me and say, "My mother died of cancer when I was young, and this book mirrored my experience," or "this book really," but with Black and Blue, they wouldn't say, "This happened to me," they'd say, "This book meant a lot to me." And I learned to read the signals. And she said, "This book meant a lot to me," and then she leaned in and she said, "I need the name of those people that help you get away." And it was all I could do to say to her, "I made it up." And that was so painful to think that someone was taking solace in something that I had invented. And I didn't do it to make things less bleak. I did it because I guess it was a certain kind of wish fulfillment that such a thing existed, that they could help Fran Flynn, that she could get away from Bobby, and that she could have a good life.
What's your favorite one of your novels?
What's my favorite of?
Your novels.
Oh, if you don't say your most recent one, you're doing it wrong. No, I mean, you have to feel like you're growing in the job, or else, given how difficult psychically the job is, you would never keep doing it. So this novel has a special place for me, mainly because of Mimi, and because of how much I like her, and how much she's not like me, but how much I admire her, and also because of the place where it's set. There's gotta be somebody.
Do you write an outline before you write your novels, or do you just write?
I feel like I should lie about the outline question. I mean, it always seems like such a sane way to write a novel, but here's the problem. The answer is no, I do not write an outline. I walk around thinking for about 6 to 8 months before I ever even start. And my thinking is almost entirely character. It's almost entirely, who's Mimi? What's her birth order? How does she do in school? Who's her best friend? What does she do in her spare time? That kind of thing. And after a while, because I start to know Mimi, I start to know Mimi's mother and Mimi's father and Mimi's best friend. And I finally sit down to write when the characters have become so clear in my mind that they're starting to actually do and say things. And the great thing is, because I've been thinking about it for so long, the first chapter is pretty simple. I mean, it's kind of all there. It's almost like transcription, which is fabulous because I finish and I think, oh God, I'm so good at this. And then comes the rest of it. And I almost always know the way the book is going to end. Not chapter and verse exactly, but in a general sense. The middle is where all the sense of discovery happens. And I think if I did an outline, what would happen is by halfway through the middle, I would have thrown it all out. The middle is where you discover the things you didn't expect would happen. The middle is where you begin to have things happen to real characters. You know, you can write a novel where you're pulling the strings, but readers look at those novels and say, no, that's not for me. I mean, they can't seem like marionettes, they're people. And that happens in the middle. And that's why the middle is, by a long shot, the hardest part of the book. There's a moment, it was funny, I was doing an on-stage interview on Monday night in Washington with my friend Connie Schultz, who used to be a columnist for The Plain Dealer and in fact won the Pulitzer for commentary. And she's working on a novel now. And someone asked me a question about process, and I said, there's this moment about 2/3 of the way through where you're sitting there and you think, this is a disaster. I've wasted a year of my life. None of this works. Why did I think I could do this? But I can't stop because it's too late to turn back now. And when I said that, I saw this look on Connie's face, and I thought, she's 2/3 of the way.
Do you read through as you're writing, or do you write all the way to the end of the first draft?
Well, we've talked about this frequently because I have 2 sons whose names are Quinn and Chris, and both of them write. And Quinn is we have to get the chapter exactly right before we move on to the next chapter. Every time we're talking about work, I wind up saying to Quinn, sweetheart, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Christopher, on the other hand, is like me, what we like to call a run like hell to the end writer. We never look back while we're writing. We just go straight on through. Boom, 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 boom. And then it's in that rereading that both of us find what's not working. But if I keep backing and filling, I'll never get anywhere. I really have to run like hell to the end.
I come from that school.
Yeah.
Here's a question. Is it a lonely existence being a writer?
Is it a lonely existence? It's an odd existence. There was just a wonderful quote, and I wish I had it in its entirety, from the fantastic Irish novelist Edna O'Brien, about how hard it is to really be truly sociable, to have a social life when you're a fiction writer. She said something like, real life is always back at the desk, but also you have nothing to talk about. You really have nothing, no, really. I mean, you know, my husband and our friends will be there, and, you know, our friend the judge will say, oh, I have this sentencing next week, and I'm looking at this and that. Jerry will say, well, you know, this defense witness looks promising, and I'm in a position to say, Mimi and her mother had an important conversation. I mean, that's, you know, that doesn't go anywhere. So it's an odd kind of life that way, and on the one hand, it's why it's really important that you have your friends. I talk to my closest friend almost every morning on the telephone as yet another excuse not to write. But at the same time, I find that unless my life is extremely humdrum, extremely set to music, really, really boring and routine, I find it very difficult to write. I feel like all the drama has to take place on the page, and the rest of my life has to be always eating the same breakfast, always eating the same lunch, always doing the same exercise routine, that kind of thing. That's my hedge against not being able to go into the world of the book.
And have you thought of wanting to see your material in a series, in a television series, or in a film? I'm thinking now of Downton Abbey, which has become so much a part of so many of our lives because the people have come to life.
I mean, one of my novels was a feature film, and a very fine one in my opinion, and two of them were television movies, which were both really good. And all of my books have been optioned by Hollywood, but that's such an incredible crapshoot. I mean, you know, somebody options it and they're all excited, and you know, we're going to do it as a series for HBO, and so is attached. And then suddenly so-and-so's not attached, or now we're going to Showtime, and so on and so forth. I mean, I think I learned my lesson about Hollywood really early on, because this man who was really dedicated to the material optioned one true thing to make as a movie. And we were with a studio, and he called me one day, he was very excited, he said, "So we're pulling the book from the studio. We're pulling the book from the studio today." And I was like, okay. And he said, "I went in there and their chief executive said, 'Does the mother really have to die?'" And I thought, okay, that's like saying, "Does Anna Karenina have to jump in front of a train?" I mean, it's the point of the whole, what? You know, and it made me, first of all, realize how crazy they are out there. And then when he turned around and called me a day later and said, "What about Meryl Streep for the mother?" To which I replied, "Is there more than one answer to that question?" And suddenly they were in production. I realized how the whole thing can turn around. So you can't hitch your wagon to that star, but when it happens, it's fantastic, and it can really make people read the book.
Hi, Liz, you scooped me a little bit in asking Hannah about, no, quite all right, about your views on social media and sort of the emerging generations of kids who I think are going to just have a very different interaction with the written word and the way they relate to the world. And I understand you may have become a grandmother very recently. Is that true? There's someone spreading nasty rumors?
But I couldn't understand the second half.
Did you just become a grandmother?
Last week.
Okay. Congratulations. I guess I'm curious to hear more about, I feel like I'm part of a generation of people who remember how it was before the internet and social media, and now are experiencing life with children who don't know what it was like before the internet and social media, and it's a real struggle. And I have a teenage daughter who says, "Mom, this is just how it is now. You need to get used to it." And it's a struggle that she and I have. And I just got an email that I have a feeling at least half the people in this room got today, announcing a documentary that's going to be shown in our town next week called Screenagers. And I'm curious just to hear more on your view as someone who is creating the written word, and your ideas of maybe what you would hope for future generations, including your grandchild, what that would be like for them.
I hear what you're saying about social media and about the ubiquity of social media, but I think a good old days approach is always a mistake because it's never grounded in reality. My grandparents used to talk all the time about how much better things were when kids didn't have television. You know, when they used to sit and listen to the radio, the stories were much more vivid, you used your imagination, it was so much better. Plato said that if poetry was ever written down, it would disappear because it was only in the oral tradition that poetry could be properly appreciated. When radio came out, they said that stage plays were going to go. When movies kiddo, when the paperback book emerged, there were endless pieces about how there would no longer be hardcovers, because why would they do hardcovers if they had paperbacks? So I think change is the only constant. And the real question is how to deal with it in a thoughtful manner. You could actually argue that one of the things that some social media has done with our kids is to make them write more. Because there was this interregnum in between when we wrote letters and when we wrote emails, which was when everything took place on the telephone, which is the ultimate evanescent form. All disappeared. At least with an email, you still have something to hold on to. And I do think that some of our kids, in terms of writing emails, in terms of writing texts, in terms of putting stuff, well, none of them are on Facebook anymore. I mean, Facebook is for women like me. That there is some communication going on. But I think as parents, it's really, really important to police it and to keep on top of it and to talk about it all the time and to suggest alternate means of creativity and expression. Now, here's a data point that's really interesting. 4 or 5 years ago, independent bookstores were saying the sky was falling. Everything was going to become digital. They were going to go out of business. Digital books have plateaued out. They've been on a plateau for, what, about 1.5 years, 2 years. The saturation looks like it's maybe 35%. But the biggest saturation is among people my age. And the people who are millennials are returning to physical books. They're turning away from digital. Now, this came as a complete surprise to me, so of course I sat down my own focus group and said, dudes, what's going on here? And my second son said to me, Mom, I always read on books. He said, our whole lives are on screen. We order food on screen, we order a car on screen, we talk to our friends on screen, we keep our pictures on screen, we write on screen. So reading is a thing apart. And with that thing apart, we want the thing itself. I think that's a turn that I would never have expected and that I think is really interesting. So that every time we tell ourselves, we know where this is heading and it's not a good place, we have to look at the data. Always important to look at the data. See, during this entire election season, all I've done is lay in an easy chair screaming, look at the data! But no one listens to me, except for Hillary Clinton. And realize that things are going to change, but that some of this change can certainly be affirmatively for the better. I mean, I've got to say something here, because everybody who talks about my business, my former business, talks about it as in good old days terms. Oh, newspapers. They were once so wonderful. Let me tell you something. The daily newspapers in the 1950s and the 60s in this country, if you look them up and read a couple of, they were really boring. They were really boringly written. They completely ignored poor people or communities of color. For most of the 50s, when they were arrested, the New York Times referred to gay men as deviants in its pages, and most newspapers slavishly took as gospel whatever both the government and big business told them was going on. Now, after Vietnam and after Watergate, there was what many of us think of as a golden age of newspapers, but I would argue that today, it's possible to be better informed in America than at any time in our country's history. And that is because most of us have access to so many different organizations. My father used to read one newspaper, the Philadelphia Bulletin, and watch one news show at night, Huntley Brinkley. There's no way. I mean, you have to, you know, I look at the BBC, I look at the Guardian, I look at the Times, at the Wall Street Journal, at the Washington Post. You know, I'm my own aggregator, and when I do that, I feel like 360 view of the world that's only been possible because of what's going on right now.
I do have a very personal question that I wasn't sure if I would ask you, but since you brought it up, I will. Do you still get home delivery of the Times?
Yes.
My husband is always arguing for the alternative, and I feel that nothing beats the newspaper spread across the table. And I think our kids look at it, and they learn about it.
But
It's a New York Times.
But I do both. I read the Times as a physical paper in the morning, but during the course of the day, I frequently will go, you know, here's the thing about the New York Times. It is the best newspaper in America, perhaps the world. It's also the best newspaper website in America, perhaps the world. So you've got kind of that best of both worlds thing going on. And that's another thing that we're finding is happening in books, which is interesting. We're finding a relatively small but not insubstantial group of people who buy books digitally and physically. They buy a book online, they really, really like it. It's something that they want to hand down or lend or so on and so forth. So then they buy the physical book, which is a phenomenon that I don't think we saw coming either.
I find it funny at readings when somebody will come up and say, I read your book on the Kindle, now I'm buying it. And I think, oh, they liked me. Like, I feel like that's the ultimate vote of confidence.
It really is true that is the ultimate vote.
And when they say, I read it on my digital device, and then they leave, you think, I failed. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. I know you have a lot of books to sign.
I'm curious to know, since we're in a middle school, about there's so much crossover readership about young adult novels. I'm curious if you've read any young adult novels, or if it's just not something that you pick up regularly. And if not young adult novels, what have you read recently that you have really, really enjoyed in your free time?
Oh, yay, my favorite question. When I go on book tour, I always try to sell somebody else's book. Because I figure I'm flying all over the country and everything, I might as well get as much traction as I can. This was not the book, but I just finished it, so I really want to mention it because it's fabulous. It's a novel that hasn't gotten enough attention. It's by a woman named Elisabeth Brundage, and it's called All Things Cease to Appear. And it's so beautifully written that there were moments where I just stopped dead in my tracks, just in awe and admiration of the observations and the sentences. It's really, really first rate. But the book I've been selling actually was published in 1965. The New York Review of Books decided a couple of years ago to make it their business to reissue books that they thought were great American novels, but that hadn't gotten sufficient traction or attention in recent years. And one of them was a book written in 1965 by a man named John Williams, who I'd never heard of, called Stoner. Thank you. I read it. I started it and I thought, this is a very serious literary novel, and I'm going to have to take my time with it. And it was propulsive, which is very odd because nothing very much happens. It's the story of a farm boy who falls in love with literature and becomes a college professor. And it is as good a novel as has been written in the 20th century. It's as good as Sister Carrie. It's as good as the Wapshad Chronicles. It's as good. I can't, it's one of the great novels of the 20th century. And I can't believe that it sat in abeyance for so long. And now I want everybody to read it, so you all should.
I just finished a literature class where the theme was that writers use their style of writing to communicate part of their message and what they want to say. If you agree with that, how do you use your style as part of the story or part of your message?
I mean, it's a little odd with this novel because it's a first-person novel, so it is my style, but it's Mimi's voice. It's very much Mimi's voice, and because of that, it's very plain-spoken in a way that I might not be, say, when I'm writing a third-person book like Still Life with Breadcrumbs or Every Last One. But if I had to characterize my own style, I would say that it's conversational and intimate. And because I want a reader first and foremost to live in the novel, I feel like that might abet that ability for them to feel as though they're there. That kind of sense of intimacy and connection that I have. But I probably don't think about style as much as I should, because it's hard for me to make the distinction between style and voice. And to some extent, I think voice is like having hazel eyes or brown hair. I mean, this is my voice, and it's my writer's voice too, even though it's the best version of that. I think particularly young writers get in trouble most when they think this is not good enough. When the fact is that given the number of novels that have been written, great novels over the centuries, this is the only thing you have that's worth bringing to the table, because it's the only thing that's different than everything that has gone before. So I'm very, very conscious of the fact that I have and have had almost an inbred voice for many, many years. And it's only when I start to write in a way that doesn't sound quite like me that I'm in trouble.
Actually, we're going to move on to the book signing now. So if you'll
Wait, I need to say something first.
No, we won't. We will wait until she says something.
Beforehand, I was over in the library that's right next door, and I said something that I really believe in, that I've said in other venues, but I'm going to say it again. And that is that I believe that in a democracy, it is as big a threat to cut library budgets as it is to cut the defense budget. So the library made this all possible tonight, and I hope in exchange you all will support it to the best of your ability. America, now more than ever, needs to be a thinking country in which people understand their history and their priorities down to the ground. And that gets done by books, and books are found in libraries, so we all need to do what we can to support them. Thank you.